and others demanded compromise. You, Ronald Reagan, preached conviction. May God bless you, and God bless America.
Minister, thank you very much for coming in to talk with us today here in 10 Downing Street. Delighted to have you with us. Here with me are George Will of ABC News and Sam Donaldson, ABC News White House correspondent. You were about to go to Washington and talk to President Reagan and no doubt have a great deal to discuss. On your list must be the question of Lebanon, where we have peacekeeping forces. You have peacekeeping forces. A great many people in the U.S. are concerned about it escalating, becoming something of a quagmire. What are your thoughts? How do you think the two countries, yours, ours, should behave there? What should we do?
Well, we have to remember it's a peacekeeping role. We went in there originally to guard over the withdrawal of troops from Beirut in the early stages. Now we're there because there's a properly elected government in the Lebanon, properly constituted Lebanese armed forces, but in considerable difficulty. Lebanon, in practice, is virtually partitioned at the moment with this wedge in the middle. I think it's perfectly all right that we carry out a peacekeeping role so long as there is a properly elected government with properly constituted Lebanese armed forces. We're there to try to secure a ceasefire, or until a ceasefire is secured, and to enable the government to carry out reconciliation. But it's a peacekeeping role.
Well, I know no national leader wants to make a depressing and unpleasing prediction. But do you see any prospect for genuine peace in Lebanon?
Lebanon is a country which has had its own troubles for quite a considerable time, but it did enjoy quite a long time of democracy and very considerable prosperity. So it has chalked up a period when it was acting fully and peacefully as a democracy. That is our objective, to secure it again. But it can only be done by the Lebanese government acting effectively.
Prime Minister, since the peacekeeping forces went in, two things have changed. First, there seems to be less peace than there was when they started. And second, the Syrians seem to, now having been invited to leave and not leaving, seem to be in a new and somewhat more ambiguous role there. What do you think can be done about the Syrians? And do you think that you can pursue peace where there is very little peace without a kind of forward, affirmative role in the use of forces?
First, Syria. You cannot achieve peace in the Middle East without the agreement of Syria. And you have constantly to talk to Syria to try to secure that peace, and that is what is happening now. I'm not quite sure about the significance of your second question. It seemed very strangely put. Well, you can't secure peace without the, what was it, the affirmative?
Well, you corrected yourself in your first answer to David. You said that they're there to secure peace or to get peace. I don't know how you put it. There's no peace.
Keep the peace.
Keep the peace where there is none, however many people think. How do you keep the peace if you don't have any? Should our forces be sent out away from fixed positions alongside the army of the elected government that we are supporting?
That when you put forces in under those circumstances, you always give them, obviously, the right of self-defense. No government could put its armed forces anywhere, even in a peacekeeping role, without the right of self-defense if they were attacked. That is what they have, and that is what each and every one of them has. Their rules of engagement are slightly different. But if you just withdraw from the Lebanon, one doubts very much whether Lebanon would have a future. You would possibly have a civil war. Now, it may be that things get worse there. It may be that we have to reconsider the future of the multinational force. But right now, there's a president. They are trying to secure a ceasefire between the factions, and they're trying to secure a policy of reconciliation between them against a background that there was a time when Lebanon was an effective democracy, and therefore there's a chance and a hope that it will be again.
But if the government at whose invitation the peacekeeping force is in Lebanon says that it needs more action, such as the use of U.S. firepower from ships and the use of French aircraft behind Syrian lines, do you think that is a good idea?
It is not for the government of the Lebanon to determine what action the United States armed forces take, nor the British Armed Forces. That is for the commander of the armed forces acting within his rules of engagement, which he will have been given by the United States government. It is he who decides, in conjunction with the United States government, what action is to be taken, not the Lebanese government in any way.
Well, Prime Minister, let's put it another way. Should the guns of the multinational force be used to support Lebanese army units around Souk el-Garb?
I imagine that the rules of engagement for the United States forces are rules of self-defense. What precisely constitutes self-defense, it's very difficult for you and I to decide sitting comfortably in number 10 Downing Street. You will have a commander there who is in charge of his forces, who must protect them. What precisely constitutes self-defense, he will have to decide in accordance with the rules of engagement he has been given.
Well, but
we can't.
Let me ask
there
about
is
your
a very
rules of
tricky. There is a very tricky period. There's a very tricky area when you have to decide: do you in fact fire back? If you don't, are you rendering your own forces more liable to future attack? I honestly don't think you and I can say that. You will have an effective commander in the field. The commanders of all the multinational force nations consult each day. But it's very easy, if I might say so,
yes,
to pontificate here. It's much more difficult to make the very tricky judgments that they have to make, and we should support those armed forces in those judgments.
But Prime
and
Minister,
not criticize
commanders
them.
in the field are not paid to make political decisions. You're paid to do that. Ronald Reagan is paid to do that. And surely you would not give your commander the right to decide to intervene on behalf of the Lebanese army unless you had decided it.
Look, I've already indicated with great respect exactly what the position is. Your president will have given that commander certain rules of engagement within which he can act and without which he cannot act. He will have to make very tricky decisions. He sometimes will have to make them quickly. These people are used to making those decisions, but the rules of engagement are decided politically. Their application must be decided by the commander on the spot. How else could you give any soldier, put any soldier anywhere?
Well, Prime Minister, I'm sorry to have to belabor this, but I'd like to try one more question.
Go on.
Is there
on,
a civil
ask
war
me.
there? Is the Lebanese army fighting civil factions attempting to overthrow what you say is legitimate government? And if so, should the multinational force take sides?
It is not for us to get involved in civil war. We must not.
Is there a civil war?
It is not for us to get involved in civil war. I do not believe there is a civil war. They are trying to achieve reconciliation between both sides. There have always been these difficulties in the Lebanon. You know the history of the Lebanon. There have been these difficulties. They overcame them for a substantial period. I believe the multinational force is there to give them a chance to overcome them again. But the actual firepower is that of the Lebanese army, which constitutes both Christians and Druze, and which takes action in defense of certain positions. Ours is a role of self-defense within the peacekeeping role.
Prime Minister, if I may change the subject, in the discussions of arms reductions with the Soviet Union, Moscow continually raises the question of the 162 missiles maintained by Britain and by France, and says in any kind of agreement these 162 should be counted as being on the NATO or the West's side. Our position has been that they should not be. I believe you have said this is a distraction. If so, in the U.S., to a great degree, it has worked. People wonder how we can ask them to ignore 162 missiles. Can you clarify your views on that?
Easily.
Or give your views on
First,
that?
the talks in Geneva, which are urgent at the moment, are talks on intermediate nuclear weapons. The SS-20s on the Soviet side, the Pershings and Crews on NATO side. Our nuclear deterrent, the Polaris fleet, to be replaced by the Trident fleet, is an irreducible minimum to act as a deterrent in the last resort, if we ever had to use it. We had that deterrent long before the SS-20s were ever designed, let alone put in place. It exists as a deterrent against the Soviet Union's strategic force. It constitutes only 2.5% of the Soviet Union's strategic weapons. When I say that, you can see it is totally irrelevant to the talks which are going on now in Geneva. It is an attempt on the part of the Soviet Union to sidetrack us from the main talks. It is an attempt to conceal the fact that the Soviet Union is not, in fact, properly and sincerely negotiating, as far as we've seen yet, at the negotiating table in Geneva. The Soviet Union, incidentally, has some 2,000 strategic missiles. We have 2.5% of that amount, and it is our final, last resort nuclear deterrent.
In your judgment, is it only the Western countries that want arms reduction?
All democracies are naturally peace-loving. They naturally want to disarm. They tend to be tempted too easily to disarm. They tend to look at other peoples very much as if they were as we are. We have to look at a potential aggressor to try to make an accurate assessment of precisely what he is like, precisely what his objective is. There is enough information to do that about the Soviet Union, about their objective of world domination and the way in which they have reacted over the past 30 years in pursuit of that objective. Therefore, we have to defend our security. What then is the question is the level at which you have to defend to deter. You have to really start equal, and then you have to try to negotiate down, but always balanced so that your deterrent is always effective. There's no doubt about the sincerity of the democracies to disarm. We have so many other things to do. Democracies don't threaten anyone. They just want to be able to live their own lives in their own way. We are absolutely sincere. I hope one day that the Soviet Union will be equally sincere.
But as of today, you are uncertain?
As today, I'm sure we are sincere in wanting to disarm. I'm not yet certain that the Soviet Union is willing to negotiate properly.
If I may interrupt briefly, we'll be back with more questions in a moment. We're back here in 10 Downing Street in London with Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher. George?
Prime Minister, periodically as deployment of the Pershings and cruise missiles draws nearer, Soviet leaders come out and say if they're deployed, you would say when they're deployed, the Soviet Union will make a counter-movement to penalize the West, and particularly the United States. As you talk with American leaders and European leaders, do you have any speculation, anticipation of what that move might be?
No, they'd probably do that in any case. They may well move forward some other weapons into the satellite countries. If they do that, they would have done it in any case. Again, everything comes to the same thing. They're constantly threatening. But at each stage when they threaten, they've already completed the modernization of some particular group of weapon, and their tactic is to try to prevent us from modernizing equally. They mustn't succeed, and one simply mustn't be taken in by these tactics. If they're sincere and want disarmament, the place to negotiate is at the table in Geneva. They are not doing it sufficiently.
A constant theme of your rhetoric about the Soviet Union is that we in the West must be wary of giving the wrong signal, a signal of weakness. And I know you've been disturbed by what I think you would call a weak European response to the Korean airline massacre. Do you think that more could have been done, both by the Europeans and should have been done by the Europeans and the United States?
I would have liked in Europe for us to stop all flights for at least a month. We couldn't get agreement on a month. The most we could get agreement for was 14 days, and not all nations agreed to that. So we had to be satisfied in the interim with 14 days. Our pilots, fortunately, have gone for longer.
But is the difference between 14 days and a month enough of a difference to give the kind of signal of strength that you talk about?
I think there is quite a difference between 14 days and a month, and it's a significant difference. But unfortunately, we couldn't get agreement to do that.
Prime Minister, the U.S. Senate has just voted to reduce the U.S. contribution to the support of the United Nations by some $480 million over a 4-year period. Was that a wise move?
Not for me to say it was a wise move on the part of the Senate. After all,
the
United States has been very, very generous in supporting the United Nations. Indeed, I sometimes wish people would recognize the generosity of the United States more than they do.
All right, may I broaden the question? Does it make sense to reduce anyone's contribution to the United Nations? Do we need the United Nations?
I believe that the world is a better place with the United Nations than it would be without it. We meet lots of other statesmen there. We can there try to influence them, influence their beliefs, and don't forget that some of them that come there, particularly from the East European bloc perhaps have never lived in a free society before. Also, don't forget that some of them have never seen the Soviet Union cross-examined about her policies before. Yes, it performs a valuable role.
Well, President Reagan seems to have endorsed an idea from his UN representative that perhaps the UN meet in New York for 6 months of the year and in Moscow for 6 months of the year, so people, particularly from third world countries, can see the difference. Do you like that idea?
I think it would be immensely expensive, and I think perhaps it's an idea, but I doubt whether it'll work.
You don't like it then?
Oh, I doubt whether it'll work. Whether I like an idea or not is not material if I think it just wouldn't work. You know, it's a tremendous organization. You have to have every single known translator. You have to have all the facilities, all the secretariat. And quite honestly, to duplicate all that seems to me an unwarranted expense, which I haven't the slightest shadow of doubt that the United States would have to pay quite a large part.
One more question on this subject, Prime Minister. If the United States had said to you that your foreign secretary could come to the UN session, but only if he came in a plane that landed at a U.S. military base and not your airliner, what would you do?
Well, knowing the United States, I should assume there's probably some very good reason why they said it, and get on the telephone and say why, and if I got a good answer, say all right.
So you think in the case of Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko, the U.S. government was correct?
You know I'm always the essence of sweet reasonableness.
And diplomacy.
And diplomacy.
Don't you really think he was happy for any excuse not to go? Because he didn't want to hear what he knew he would hear once he got there?
I think it's a great pity that he's not going. I think I know why he's not going.
Why?
Why?
Because he doesn't want to go and hear what he knows he will hear about the Korean airliner. Because in their heart of hearts they know they were wrong. They know not only were they totally wrong, but they have handled it very, very badly indeed. And it would have been far better had, when they knew the full enormity of what had happened, had they said, this is a tragedy, where we are deeply sorry, it should never have happened, and will pay full compensation. The world would, I think, would have then taken a very different view, and if they'd added, will take steps to see that it doesn't happen again. It would have been a very different Soviet Union from the one that it is. But don't forget, they reacted in accordance with their fundamental character, and that's a fact we too have to take into account.
Is Andropov a monster?
I would not use any such words in relation to any politician. Mr. Andropov, his history you know. He was in Hungary at the time when the Soviet tanks rolled in. He has spent a very long time in KGB. He has never lived in a free society or visited a free society. All of these are factors which we have to take into account in trying to make judgments of him. But I don't think descriptions like that help anyone.
Prime Minister, Americans are very interested in comparisons with Thatcherism and Reaganism as domestic policies, and there is one difference, and that is the American deficit is enormous, and your public borrowing, your deficit, is comparatively quite small. And one reason for that may be that taxes actually are higher after 4 years of your government than they were before, because you have had the trouble that all governments have had in cutting public spending. It too is higher than when you came in. I know you don't like to give advice to your sister republic across the sea, but do you think the American deficit is sufficiently disruptive to the world and ominous that if the president has as much trouble cutting public spending as you have had, that he should consider, as you have done, raising taxes?
I think the president would like to get public expenditure down. I think he would like to get the deficit down. I think he's determined to get the deficit down, not by the classic way of raising taxes, but by the more fundamental way of reducing public expenditure. In that, he has Congress and their views to consider, and Congress, of course, will make its views very well known. I took the view in this country that as I couldn't get public expenditure down, and therefore public expenditure remained a higher proportion of national income than I would have wished because of the world recession, that it was better to get taxation up than to keep high borrowing. The reason is clear for all to see. A large amount of borrowing can only be done if people are tempted by high interest rates. High interest rates tend to stop a lot of construction, a lot of investment in small businesses. That stops a recovery from getting underway as much as it should. it also puts some other countries that are in severe debt in even worse trouble, makes it even more difficult for them to repay their interest and to repay the principal. So I took the view that it's better to have lower interest rates. It also has one other effect. If you're pursuing high interest rates and your recovery does not get underway as fast as it should, your defense expenditure takes up a higher proportion of your national income, and that can cause problems. So there are many, many reasons why I said, right, I want to get interest rates as low as my action can possibly get them. And I, therefore, if I can't get public expenditure down, will take the road of putting up taxation to reduce the deficit.
Well, a number of people say if Prime Minister Thatcher, who has more control over Parliament than any American president shall ever have over Congress, can't cut public spending, is it the case that the modern welfare state then is totally out of control?
No, it is not. It's very easy to talk about cutting expenditure. It's very difficult to decide where. But I think most people who have been in charge know that one of the great contributions you can make over future years is not only by cutting public expenditure, where you can't cut it, to contain it, to see that it doesn't rise as fast as it otherwise would. Then in a period of growth, your public expenditure is a lower proportion. And that we've tried to do. And we've kept absolutely on target with our public expenditure last year. What we decided the previous year would be the total we would spend. We kept within it. And I hope we'll be able to do the same this year. So that we are effectively controlling it.
Prime Minister, every welfare state in the world, yours, ours, most of those in Western Europe and Scandinavia, are having financial troubles. Do you foresee a constantly rising taxes and debts from here to the horizon? Do you see any way out of it?
No. I would probably take a slightly more optimistic view than you do. I think what has happened, and you have to look at the whole of the post-war period, is people somehow assumed that growth would go on forever. It was going on for quite a long time. Then all of a sudden, inflation came in and stopped quite a lot of growth. We had to come to terms with inflation. We got a lot of newly industrialized countries who competed with us in our traditional markets for products, and all of a sudden, that growth stopped. But people's expectations went on, and it's taken quite some time for the expectations of the future to come into line with what future prospects are. It's going to be much harder to achieve that growth in this world, but it can be done. But they still got accustomed to thinking you could have both better public services and higher income, and somehow that would come about not by their own effort, but by some magic formula. Now they're much, much more realistic, and that's much more healthy.
I think in an earlier answer you took sides in a dispute unwittingly that's going on within the American administration. I believe you have said that it is your conviction that high deficits, high public borrowing, causes high interest rates. Is that your view?
Yes, it is. In this country, it does. It is not the only thing which can cause high interest rates. Inflation is another very, very important factor. And there are many people who say, well, inflation is low now, therefore interest rates will be low. But when you're having to lend to a government, you are looking what the inflation is likely to be, not only now, but in some 10 years' time, if you're lending for 10 years. And that has an effect. And that, if you're running a high deficit, can tend to keep interest rates higher. If you haven't got to raise as much money, your interest rates can go down faster.
Excuse me.
I'm so sorry.
Do you think President Reagan will run again?
You're asking me to interfere.
Oh, no. I'm not asking whether you would like it or not. Let me say
this. If I were asked a plain, straight opinion, yes, I believe he will run again. I do not know, but I believe he will run again.
That wouldn't displease you?
No.
On that note, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us today and for having us here at 10 Downing Street.
It's my pleasure. I hope you've enjoyed it
enormously.